Forgotten winter survival methods in the Middle Ages. Winter in the Middle Ages was not simply a season, it was a test of survival. For people living hundreds of years ago, winter meant months of darkness, freezing winds, and a constant battle against hunger and cold. There were no electric heaters, no insulated homes, no supermarkets stocked with food. Yet medieval communities survived year after year through winters that were often far harsher than what most of us experience today. What is remarkable is that many of the methods they used to survive have been forgotten over time. These were not small tricks or simple habits. They were carefully developed systems built through generations of experience. To understand how medieval people survived winter, we have to imagine a world where preparation for the cold began long before the first snow fell. The medieval year revolved around survival planning. As spring arrived, farmers were already thinking about the coming winter. Crops were planted not just for immediate use, but specifically for storage. Fields of barley, rye, and wheat were grown because these grains could last for months when properly dried and stored. Vegetables that could survive cold climates were especially valuable. Cabbage, turnips, onions, and leeks were staples of the medieval diet. These foods were hardy, filling, and most importantly, they could be preserved. But food alone was not enough. People had to prepare their homes to face months of cold. Medieval houses were very different from modern homes. Many were built with thick stone walls or heavy wooden beams. While these houses might seem primitive, their design actually helped trap heat. Small windows were common because large openings would allow too much warmth to escape. Instead of glass, many windows were covered with oiled cloth or wooden shutters. Inside the house, the hearth was the heart of the home. The fire burned almost constantly during winter. It provided warmth, light, and a place to cook food. Families gathered around it during the long, dark evenings, not only to stay warm, but also to work. Winter evenings were often spent repairing tools, sewing clothes, and preparing equipment for the next farming season. Another forgotten survival method was the way medieval people layered their clothing. Clothing was one of the most important defenses against the cold. Wool was the most common material because it could trap body heat even when slightly damp. People wore multiple layers. A linen shirt would be worn closest to the skin, followed by wool garments such as tunics or gowns. Cloaks made from thick wool were often used outdoors. Fur was especially valuable during harsh winters. Animal skins from sheep, rabbits, foxes, and other animals were used to line coats and cloaks. Even the poorest villagers understood the importance of proper clothing during winter. A well-made wool garment could mean the difference between comfort and suffering. But warmth did not come only from clothing. Medieval sleeping arrangements were designed to conserve body heat. Most people did not sleep alone in separate beds, the way many people do today. Beds were often shared by multiple family members. This might seem unusual to modern readers, but sharing body warmth helped everyone stay warmer through cold nights. Beds were also surrounded by thick curtains when possible. These curtains helped trap warm air around the sleeper. Straw mattresses were common, and they were often topped with wool blankets and animal skins. Some wealthier households even used bed warmers. These were metal or ceramic containers filled with hot coals that could be placed inside the bed for a short time before sleeping. It was a simple but effective way to make cold winter nights more bearable. Another survival strategy involved food preservation. During summer and autumn, families worked hard to preserve as much food as possible. Meat was often salted or smoked, so it could last for months without spoiling. Fish was preserved in similar ways, especially in coastal regions or near rivers. Vegetables were pickled or stored in root cellars. Root cellars were underground storage spaces that maintained a stable temperature. They prevented vegetables from freezing, while also keeping them cool enough to last for long periods. Cabbage was sometimes fermented to create early forms of preserved foods similar to sauerkraut. These foods were rich in nutrients and could be stored throughout winter. Grains were another vital part of winter survival. Bread was the foundation of the medieval diet. In many communities, baking was done in communal ovens. Large batches of bread would be prepared regularly because bread could last several days and provided a reliable source of energy. Porridge and stews were also extremely common winter foods. These meals allowed people to stretch small amounts of meat or vegetables into large portions that could feed entire families. Another forgotten method involved animal management. Animals were incredibly important during winter months. Chickens provided eggs when possible, though production slowed during the cold season. Cows, goats, and sheep provided milk, which could be turned into cheese and butter. But feeding animals during winter was a major challenge. Farmers had to gather and store large amounts of hay during summer. This hay would be used to feed livestock when snow covered the fields, and grazing became impossible. Animals were often kept close to homes, or even inside parts of buildings. This practice not only protected the animals from freezing temperatures, but also helped warm the structure slightly. The heat generated by animals could make a noticeable difference inside medieval homes and barns. Fuel was another essential part of winter survival. Firewood had to be collected and stored long before winter arrived. Forests were carefully managed in many regions because wood was such an important resource. Families spent weeks cutting, splitting, and stacking wood to prepare for the cold season. Without enough firewood, survival during winter could become extremely difficult. But perhaps one of the most overlooked aspects of medieval winter survival was community cooperation. Villages depended heavily on shared labor. Neighbors helped each other harvest crops, gather firewood, and repair buildings before winter began. If one family struggled, others often stepped in to help. This cooperation was not just kindness, it was necessary for survival. In harsh winters, isolation could be dangerous. Community networks allowed resources and knowledge to be shared, increasing the chances that everyone would survive until spring. Religion and seasonal traditions also played a role in winter survival. Festivals and gatherings during winter months helped maintain morale during the long, dark season. These events provided food, warmth, and a sense of unity within the community. Psychological strength was just as important as physical preparation. People understood that winter would eventually end. The promise of spring helped communities endure months of cold and hardship. But winter in the Middle Ages was not always predictable. Some winters were mild, while others were brutally cold. During periods such as the early stages of the Little Ice Age, temperatures dropped dramatically across parts of Europe. Rivers froze solid. Snow covered fields for months. Food shortages became more common during these extreme seasons. In these moments, survival depended on preparation and adaptability. Families rationed their food carefully. Communities relied on stored grains and preserved foods. Travel became difficult, and many people stayed close to home until conditions improved. Yet, despite these challenges, medieval societies endured. They developed systems, traditions, and knowledge that allowed them to survive in a world without modern technology. Their methods were not always comfortable, but they were effective. many of these forgotten survival techniques reveal something fascinating about human resilience. People in the Middle Ages understood their environment in ways that modern society sometimes forgets. They observed the seasons closely. They planned months in advance, and they built communities that could endure even the harshest winters. Their survival was not based on convenience. It was based on preparation, cooperation, and knowledge passed down through generations. And as we continue exploring these forgotten winter survival methods, we will discover even more surprising strategies that helped medieval people endure the coldest months of the year. Because beyond the fires, the food stores, and the heavy wool clothing, there were many other secrets that played a role in winter survival. Some of them were simple, some of them were ingenious, and many of them have almost disappeared from modern memory. Yet they remain a powerful reminder of how people once lived in harmony with the rhythms of nature. As winter settled over medieval landscapes, life slowed in ways that modern societies rarely experience. Fields that had been full of activity during the warmer months became silent under frost and snow. The constant labor of planting and harvesting gave way to a quieter rhythm of survival, maintenance, and patience. But winter was not a time of complete rest. In many ways, it was one of the most critical periods of the year. The success or failure of preparations made months earlier now became clear. If firewood had been gathered properly, homes stayed warm. If food stores had been managed carefully, families could eat regularly. But if supplies ran short, the consequences could be severe. One of the lesser-known winter survival methods involved the design of medieval kitchens. The hearth was not only used for warmth and cooking, it was also a central tool for food preservation and water heating. Large iron pots often hung above the fire throughout the day. Inside them, soups or stews simmered slowly. These pots were rarely emptied completely. Instead, ingredients were added gradually over time. Vegetables, grains, bits of meat, and herbs were combined into thick stews that could feed a household for days. The constant simmering helped keep the food safe and warm, while allowing flavors to blend together. This method made efficient use of limited ingredients and ensured that nothing went to waste. In colder regions, another clever technique was used to keep liquids from freezing. Water buckets and containers were often placed close to the hearth overnight. The gentle heat from the fire prevented them from turning into solid ice. This might seem simple, but access to liquid water was essential during winter. Without it, cooking, cleaning, and feeding animals would become far more difficult. Another survival strategy involved the careful management of light. Winter days were short, and darkness arrived early. Candles were valuable, and not always easy to produce. Most were made from animal fat, known as tallow, though wealthier households sometimes used beeswax candles. Because of their value, candles were used sparingly. Families arranged their activities around the limited daylight hours. Tasks requiring detailed work were usually done during the day, while evenings were reserved for simpler activities, such as storytelling, mending clothes, or preparing tools. Storytelling itself played an important role in winter life. Long nights created an opportunity for traditions to be passed down through generations. Legends, historical tales, and practical knowledge were shared orally around the fire. Through these stories, children learned about farming, weather patterns, animals, and the history of their communities. This exchange of knowledge helped preserve survival skills that might otherwise have been forgotten. Another forgotten method of winter survival involved the use of insulation inside homes. Medieval houses often used materials that might surprise modern readers. Walls could be lined with woven reeds, cloth hangings, or animal hides. These materials helped reduce drafts and keep warm air inside. Floors were sometimes covered with thick layers of straw or rushes. These natural materials acted as insulation, while also providing some comfort underfoot. Rushes were often replaced periodically because they could become dirty over time. But during winter, they provided an extra layer of warmth that stone or dirt floors alone could not offer. Even doorways were designed with warmth in mind. Heavy wooden doors and fabric coverings helped prevent cold air from rushing inside whenever someone entered the house. In some cases, families hung thick cloth curtains near entrances to create a barrier against the wind. Another clever winter survival technique involved cooking methods. Baking bread or roasting food in ovens generated significant heat. After the cooking was finished, the remaining warmth inside the oven could still be used. Some families placed food inside the cooling oven overnight to dry it or keep it warm. Others used the remaining heat to warm nearby rooms. Nothing was wasted. Another overlooked survival method involved personal hygiene. During winter, bathing frequently was difficult due to the cold temperatures and the effort required to heat water. However, medieval people still found ways to stay reasonably clean. Warm cloths were often used to wash hands and faces. Herbs with pleasant scents were sometimes used to freshen clothing or living spaces. Maintaining cleanliness helped prevent illness during a time when medical knowledge was limited. Illness during winter could spread quickly within households. Cold weather forced people to stay indoors for long periods, often in close quarters. To reduce sickness, many families relied on herbal remedies. Plants such as sage, thyme, and rosemary were valued not only for cooking, but also for their believed health benefits. Herbal teas were commonly used to soothe coughs or relieve discomfort during the cold months. Another interesting survival practice involved the storage of fermented foods. Fermentation was an ancient preservation technique that required little equipment. Vegetables such as cabbage, carrots, and cucumbers could be fermented using salt and natural bacteria. This process preserved the food while also adding beneficial nutrients. Fermented foods were especially valuable during winter because they helped provide vitamins when fresh vegetables were unavailable. Another important winter strategy involved maintaining tools. Winter offered a rare period when farmers had time to repair equipment. Plows, axes, knives, and other tools were sharpened and fixed. This work was essential because broken tools during the busy farming season could delay critical tasks. Woodworking also became more common during winter months. Men and women crafted household items such as bowls, spoons, handles, and storage containers. These handmade objects were practical and often lasted for many years. Another survival technique involved controlling smoke inside the house. Many early medieval homes did not have chimneys. Smoke from the hearth slowly rose through openings in the roof. While this might seem unpleasant, the smoke actually had some unexpected benefits. It helped preserve wooden beams and thatched roofs by keeping insects away. Smoke also helped dry and preserve certain foods that were hung above the hearth. Fish and strips of meat could be slowly smoked over time, extending their shelf life during the winter months. Another important aspect of winter survival involved travel. Movement during winter was often dangerous. Snow, ice, and freezing winds made long journeys risky. As a result, most travel was limited unless absolutely necessary. Merchants, messengers, and travelers sometimes waited until conditions improved before continuing their journeys. Villages often became more isolated during winter. This isolation increased the importance of local self-sufficiency. Communities that had prepared well could survive months without outside assistance. Those that had not prepared faced serious challenges. Another forgotten survival method involved managing body heat through activity. Physical work helped generate warmth. Even during winter, people found tasks that kept them moving. Chopping wood, caring for animals, repairing structures, and preparing tools all produced heat through physical effort. This activity reduced the need for additional fuel while keeping people warm. Children also played an important role during winter months. They helped with simple chores such as gathering small pieces of wood, feeding animals, and carrying water. These tasks taught them responsibility and survival skills from an early age. But winter life was not entirely harsh. There were also moments of comfort. Shared meals around the fire created a sense of warmth and connection. Songs and stories filled the long night. Simple games and gatherings helped people pass the time while waiting for spring. Seasonal celebrations were particularly important. Festivals held during winter brought communities together. They provided an opportunity to share food, strengthen relationships, and celebrate the passing of the darkest days of the year. These traditions helped maintain hope during difficult months. Hope was an essential survival tool. Medieval people understood that winter was temporary. Even the harshest cold would eventually give way to warmer days. Snow would melt, fields would thaw, and life would begin again with the arrival of spring. Until that moment arrived, survival depended on knowledge, preparation, and resilience. And as we continue exploring these forgotten winter survival methods, we will uncover even more fascinating strategies used by medieval communities. Because hidden within the routines of daily life were countless small techniques that help people endure one of the most challenging seasons of the year. Some involved clever uses of natural materials. Others relied on cooperation between families and neighbors. And many reflected a deep understanding of the natural world. These forgotten methods remind us that survival in the Middle Ages was not simply about enduring the cold. It was about adapting to it, learning from it, and building ways of life that allowed entire communities to persist through the long winter months. As winter deepened across medieval Europe, the landscape transformed into something both beautiful and dangerous. Frost clung to tree branches, rivers slowed beneath sheets of ice, and fields that once fed entire communities lay silent beneath snow. For medieval people, however, winter was never simply about enduring the cold. It was about understanding the environment and working with it. Many survival methods that people used during the Middle Ages came from generations of observation. Knowledge was passed from parents to children, from neighbors to travelers, and from elders who had lived through many winters. One such forgotten method involved the careful placement of homes and villages. Medieval settlements were often built in locations that offered natural protection from the worst winter conditions. Villages were commonly placed in valleys where hills or forests blocked strong winds. This natural barrier reduced the force of cold winter storms. Forests were especially valuable during winter. They acted as windbreaks and also provided one of the most important winter resources: wood. Firewood was essential not only for warmth, but also for cooking and lighting. Because of this, medieval communities developed careful systems for managing nearby forests. Trees were not simply cut without thought. Instead, certain areas were harvested, while others were allowed to regrow. This form of forest management ensured that wood would remain available year after year. In some regions, people gathered not only large logs, but also small branches and fallen wood. Even the smallest pieces could be used to start fires or maintain heat. Nothing was wasted. Another winter survival method involved managing indoor air and warmth. While the hearth provided heat, it could also fill homes with smoke. Medieval people learned how to control this through simple architectural techniques. Holes in the roof, sometimes called smoke holes, allowed smoke to escape slowly while keeping most of the warm air inside. Later in the Middle Ages, chimneys became more common in wealthier homes. These structures improved ventilation and made it easier to maintain fires indoors. But even before chimneys became widespread, people had adapted their lifestyles to the presence of smoke. The smoky air inside many homes had an unexpected benefit. It helped preserve wooden beams and thatched roofs by discouraging insects and mold. It also contributed to the slow smoking of foods hung above the hearth. Meat, fish, and sausages were often suspended from beams where the rising smoke could dry and preserve them. This method allowed food to last longer during winter, when fresh supplies were limited. Another survival strategy involved the clever use of clothing beyond simple layering. Medieval people paid attention to how garments trapped air. Loose wool clothing created small pockets of warm air around the body. These pockets acted as insulation, helping to retain body heat. Head coverings were especially important. A significant amount of body heat can escape through the head, and medieval people understood this through experience. Hoods, wool caps, and fur-lined hats were commonly worn during winter months. Gloves and mittens were also used when possible, though they were not always available to everyone. Footwear presented another challenge during winter. Leather shoes were common, but they did not always provide strong protection against snow and ice. To improve warmth, people often stuffed their shoes with wool, straw, or fabric scraps. This extra layer helped insulate the feet and keep them warmer during long periods outdoors. Straw was used in many creative ways during winter. Inside barns and homes, it provided bedding for both humans and animals. Straw could trap warmth and reduce contact with cold ground or floors. Even travelers sometimes carried small bundles of straw to create temporary insulation when resting during journeys. Another important survival technique involved managing food portions carefully. Winter food supplies had to last until the next harvest season. Families learned to ration their stored foods over many months. Large meals were rare during the hardest parts of winter. Instead, people often relied on filling but simple foods, such as bread, porridge, beans, and root vegetables. Stews remained one of the most practical meals. They allowed small amounts of ingredients to feed many people, while also providing warmth. Another clever survival method involved using animal fat. Fat was an extremely valuable resource during winter because it contained a high amount of energy. Animal fat could be used in cooking, turned into candles, or even applied to leather to make clothing and boots more resistant to moisture. In cold climates, foods rich in fat helped people maintain body heat and energy. This is one reason why winter meals often included preserved meats, cheese, and butter whenever available. Another fascinating winter survival strategy involved storing ice and snow intentionally. While this might seem strange, some medieval communities collected ice during the coldest months and stored it in deep pits or insulated structures. These early ice houses allowed ice to last well into warmer seasons. Though primarily used by wealthier households or monasteries, this technique demonstrated an advanced understanding of temperature and insulation. Monasteries played an important role in preserving winter survival knowledge. Monks and nuns often kept written records about farming, food preservation, and herbal medicine. These records helped pass practical knowledge from one generation to another. Monasteries also maintained gardens where medicinal plants were grown. During winter, dried herbs from these gardens were used to create remedies for common illnesses. Cold weather illnesses were a serious threat in medieval times. Coughs, fevers, and infections could spread quickly within crowded homes. Herbal remedies such as mint, sage, and thyme were commonly used in teas or mixtures to ease symptoms. While these treatments were not cures for every illness, they often provided comfort and relief. Another survival method involved protecting water sources. In winter, wells and streams could freeze. To prevent this, people sometimes covered wells with wooden lids or straw insulation. This helped slow the freezing process and ensured continued access to water. Fetching water during winter could be difficult and dangerous, especially if paths were icy. Families often stored extra water inside their homes whenever possible. Another forgotten practice involved the use of communal ovens. In many villages, baking bread was not done individually in every home. Instead, communities shared large ovens. Families brought their dough to the oven and baked their bread together. This method saved fuel and allowed multiple households to cook efficiently. Communal ovens also became social centers where villagers exchanged news, stories, and practical advice. These gatherings strengthened community bonds during the isolating winter months. Another interesting survival habit involved the rhythm of sleep. Before modern lighting, medieval people often experienced segmented sleep. People sometimes slept for several hours, woke briefly during the night, and then returned to sleep again. During this quiet period in the middle of the night, some individuals prayed, reflected, or tended the fire. This pattern of sleep allowed them to maintain warmth by checking the hearth and adding wood when necessary. Fire management was an essential skill. A fire that burned too strongly wasted valuable wood, while a weak fire might not provide enough warmth. Experienced household members learned how to maintain steady heat throughout the night. Ashes from the fire were also reused. Ash could be used in cleaning, soap making, and even as fertilizer for future crops. Nothing in a medieval household was wasted if it could serve another purpose. Another survival strategy involved observing animals and weather patterns. Farmers watched the behavior of birds, livestock, and wild animals for signs of changing weather. These observations helped them anticipate storms or sudden temperature drops. For example, animals seeking shelter earlier than usual might signal an approaching snowstorm. This practical knowledge allowed communities to prepare before conditions became dangerous. As winter continued, patience became one of the most valuable survival skills. Days were short, and progress towards spring felt slow. Yet medieval people understood that winter was part of a larger cycle. Their survival depended on respecting that cycle and preparing carefully for each season. By combining practical knowledge, cooperation, and resilience, medieval communities managed to endure winters that could last for many months. And still, many of their most interesting survival methods remain largely forgotten today. But as we continue exploring the hidden strategies of medieval winter life, even more surprising techniques will emerge. Some of them reveal incredible creativity. Others show how deeply people understood the natural world around them. And together, they paint a vivid picture of how entire societies survived one of the most challenging seasons of the year. By the middle of winter, medieval life entered its most difficult phase. The early excitement of the first snowfall had long faded, and the cold had settled deeply into daily routines. Rivers were frozen. Fields were buried under layers of snow, and the sun appeared only briefly each day. For medieval communities, this period required patience and careful management of resources. One of the most important survival methods involved the way homes were constructed and maintained during winter months. Medieval houses were rarely built with comfort as the primary goal. Instead, they were designed for practicality and survival. Thick stone walls, timber frames, and thatched roofs helped create structures that could endure harsh weather. Stone buildings were especially valuable in cold climates because stone retained heat. During the day, when fires burned inside the house, the walls absorbed warmth. Slowly, that warmth was released throughout the evening and night. This natural heat storage helped maintain a more stable indoor temperature. Another important feature of medieval homes was their compact design. Rooms were often small and closely connected. This allowed heat from the central hearth to spread more effectively through the building. Large open spaces would have allowed warmth to escape too quickly. Families often spent most of their time in a single main room during winter. This room served many purposes. It was a place for cooking, eating, working, and resting. By concentrating activity in one space, people conserved heat and fuel. Another forgotten winter survival method involved the use of tapestries and wall hangings. In wealthier homes and castles, thick tapestries covered stone walls. While these decorations are often remembered for their beauty, they also served an important practical purpose. Stone walls could become extremely cold during winter. Tapestries created an insulating layer that reduced drafts and helped retain warmth inside rooms. Even in simpler homes, cloth, animal hides, or woven materials were sometimes hung along walls to reduce heat loss. These small adjustments made a noticeable difference during long, cold nights. Another clever technique involved the placement of beds. Beds were rarely positioned against outside walls if it could be avoided. Instead, they were placed closer to the interior of the house, where temperatures were slightly warmer. Some beds were built inside wooden frames or enclosed spaces known as box beds. These structures created a small, insulated sleeping area that trapped body heat. Curtains around beds served the same purpose. When the curtains were closed, warm air remained around the sleeper, making cold nights far more comfortable. Heating water was another important winter practice. Hot water served many purposes. It was used for washing, cooking, and sometimes for warming sleeping areas. Ceramic or metal containers filled with hot water could be wrapped in cloth and placed near the body to provide warmth. These early forms of hot water bottles helped people sleep more comfortably during freezing nights. Another survival strategy involved the management of snow around buildings. Heavy snow accumulation could damage roofs or block doorways. Families regularly cleared paths and removed snow from critical areas around their homes. However, snow was not always considered an enemy. In some cases, snow actually provided insulation. Snow piled against the outer walls of buildings could act as a barrier against cold wind, helping reduce heat loss from inside. This natural insulation worked in a similar way to modern building techniques. Another fascinating winter survival method involved travel across frozen landscapes. Although travel was often limited during winter, frozen rivers sometimes became temporary roads. When water froze solid, It created smooth surfaces that allowed sleds to move more easily than carts on muddy roads. In northern regions, sleds pulled by animals were commonly used to transport goods across snow-covered terrain. These sleds allowed traders to continue moving supplies even during the coldest months. However, travel still carried significant risks. Ice could break, snowstorms could reduce visibility, and freezing temperatures made long journeys dangerous. Because of these risks, travelers often planned their routes carefully and stopped at inns or monasteries whenever possible. Monasteries played another important role during winter. Beyond preserving knowledge and growing medicinal plants, monasteries often served as shelters for travelers. Their thick stone buildings and organized food storage systems made them reliable places for warmth and rest. Monks also maintained detailed calendars and records of seasonal patterns. These records helped communities anticipate harsh winters and prepare accordingly. Another overlooked survival method involved the storage of grains. Grain was one of the most important winter food sources. Large storage bins or granaries were used to keep grain dry and safe from pests. Elevated storage structures prevented rodents from reaching valuable supplies. Some granaries were raised on wooden stilts or supported by stone pillars. This simple design protected food from moisture and animals. Grain could then be ground into flour whenever needed. Mills powered by water or wind were used to grind grain into usable forms. But during winter, frozen rivers sometimes stopped water mills from operating. When this happened, communities relied on stored flour or hand grinding methods. Hand grinding grain was slow and labor intensive, but it ensured that bread and porridge could still be prepared. Another important survival strategy involved maintaining livestock during winter months. Animals required careful management because they depended on stored food. Hay gathered during summer was essential. Without enough hay, livestock could weaken or die before spring. Barns and shelters protected animals from wind and snow. These buildings were often designed with thick walls and limited openings to conserve warmth. Farmers also used straw bedding to insulate animals from frozen ground. This bedding not only kept animals comfortable, but also helped retain body heat inside the barn. Animal care during winter was critical because livestock represented future food, clothing, and labor. Using animals during winter could create serious problems for the following year. Another interesting winter survival method involved preserving fruit. While fresh fruits were mostly unavailable during winter, some varieties could be dried during autumn. Apples, berries, and other fruits were sliced and dried near fires or in warm environments. Dried fruits lasted much longer and provided valuable nutrients during cold months. They were often added to breads, porridges, or special meals during festivals. Speaking of festivals, winter celebrations played an important psychological role. Long periods of darkness and cold could affect morale. Celebrations offered moments of joy and community connection. Music, food, and shared gatherings helped people forget the harshness of winter, even if only for a short time. These celebrations often took place around important seasonal points, such as the winter solstice or religious holidays. They reminded people that winter was temporary and that spring would eventually return. Another forgotten survival practice involved using natural materials to improve warmth. Moss, wool scraps, and plant fibers were sometimes stuffed into gaps between wooden beams. This acted as a form of insulation, reducing drafts inside homes. Simple techniques like this could make a significant difference during freezing nights. Another strategy involved managing daily schedules according to sunlight. With limited daylight, people organized their activities carefully. Important outdoor tasks were completed during the brief hours of daylight. Indoor work continued after sunset, using the light of the hearth or candles. But because lighting resources were limited, evenings often remained quiet and focused on simple activities. The pace of life naturally slowed. Yet this slower rhythm allowed people to conserve energy and resources. Winter demanded patience and resilience. Every day that passed brought communities one step closer to the return of spring. And despite the hardships, medieval people developed an impressive range of techniques to survive these long, cold months. Many of these methods may seem simple today, but together they formed a powerful system of survival. Through careful preparation, cooperation, and knowledge of the natural world, medieval societies endured winters that might otherwise have been devastating. And as we continue exploring these forgotten survival strategies, even more remarkable techniques will emerge. Because winter survival in the Middle Ages was not only about warmth and food, it was also about adaptability, creativity, and the ability to live in balance with the changing seasons. As winter continued into its deepest months, medieval life became a careful balance between endurance and preservation. By this stage of the season, the landscape often looked completely different from the world people had known just a few months earlier. Snow-covered fields, trees stood bare against grey skies, and many roads became difficult to travel. Yet daily life did not stop. For medieval families, survival meant continuing the quiet routines that allowed them to endure until the return of spring. One of the most important yet often forgotten winter survival methods involved health and medicine. Cold weather brought a number of challenges for the human body. Coughs, fevers, and respiratory illnesses were common during the winter months. Without modern medicine, medieval people relied heavily on natural remedies. Herbal knowledge was a central part of winter survival. Throughout the warmer seasons, families gathered plants that could later be dried and stored. These herbs were kept in bundles hanging from wooden beams or stored in small containers. When illness appeared, these plants were turned into teas, mixtures, or poultices. Sage was commonly used to soothe sore throats and improve breathing. Thyme was valued for its strong scent and was believed to help clear congestion. Mint was often brewed into hot drinks to calm stomach problems and provide warmth. Hot herbal drinks served two important purposes. They helped relieve symptoms while also warming the body during cold days. Another important practice involved the use of steam and heat. When someone became ill, heated water could be placed near the person to create gentle steam. Breathing warm steam sometimes helped ease coughing or chest discomfort. This simple method required little equipment, but could provide noticeable relief. Medieval people also believed strongly in the healing power of warmth. A warm environment was considered essential for recovery. Sick individuals were often placed close to the hearth, where they could remain comfortable. Blankets, wool clothing, and animal skins helped retain body heat. Another forgotten survival method involved protecting the body from extreme cold while working outdoors. Even during winter, some outdoor work was necessary. Farmers still needed to care for animals, gather wood, and maintain buildings. To survive these conditions, people paid close attention to how long they remained outside. Work was often done in short periods, followed by time near the fire to warm up. This simple strategy helped prevent dangerous cold exposure. Another fascinating survival technique involved the way castles and larger buildings managed heat. Castles are often imagined as cold stone structures, but many contain clever features designed to improve warmth. Large fireplaces were built into thick stone walls. These fireplaces could produce substantial heat. In some castles, heated air from the fireplace passed through narrow channels within the walls before exiting through chimneys. This helped distribute warmth more effectively through certain areas of the building. While castles were still far from comfortable by modern standards, these designs improved living conditions during winter. Thick stone walls also played an important role. Like many medieval houses, they absorbed heat during the day and slowly released it during the night. Another technique used in castles involved the use of portable heat sources. Metal containers filled with burning charcoal were sometimes used to warm specific rooms or spaces. These containers could be moved where warmth was needed most. Of course, this method required careful attention because charcoal could produce dangerous fumes if used improperly. Even so, when managed correctly, it provided additional warmth during particularly cold nights. Another important winter survival strategy involved the careful observation of weather patterns. Medieval people lived closely connected to nature. Over time, they developed a strong understanding of seasonal changes. Cloud patterns, wind direction, and animal behavior often provided clues about upcoming weather. For example, a sudden shift in wind from certain directions could signal the arrival of a snowstorm. Birds flying lower than usual sometimes suggested worsening conditions. By recognizing these signs, communities could prepare before storms arrived. Animals themselves required special attention during winter. Livestock needed protection, not only from cold, but also from hunger. Feeding animals during winter required large supplies of hay or stored grains. Farmers checked their animals daily to ensure they remained healthy. Water troughs often froze during cold nights, so farmers sometimes broke ice each morning to allow animals to drink. Without water, livestock could quickly weaken. Another forgotten practice involved the careful use of animal waste. Manure collected during winter was stored for future use as fertilizer. Though it might not sound pleasant, this practice ensured that fields would remain productive when spring arrived. Manure piles also generated heat as they decomposed. In some cases, this natural warmth helped prevent nearby areas from freezing completely. Another interesting survival technique involved the preservation of dairy products. Milk from cows, goats, or sheep was sometimes turned into cheese during the colder months. Cheese lasted much longer than fresh milk and could be stored for extended periods. Butter was another important product. In colder temperatures, butter remained solid and easier to store. These dairy foods provided valuable fats and calories needed to maintain energy during winter. Another important element of winter survival involved maintaining mental strength. Long winters could feel endless. Darkness arrived early, and cold weather limited travel and outdoor activity. To cope with this, medieval communities relied heavily on traditions, music, and storytelling. Songs were often shared during gatherings around the fire. These songs told stories about history, religion, or legendary heroes. They also helped people pass time and maintain a sense of connection. Storytelling was particularly important for children. Through stories, they learned about past winters, successful harvests, and lessons about survival. These narratives preserved knowledge that might otherwise be lost. Another survival method involved maintaining tools and equipment. Winter provided an opportunity to repair farming tools that had worn down during the previous seasons. Blacksmiths became especially busy during this time. They repaired metal parts of plows, axes, and knives. Sharp tools were essential for cutting wood and preparing land when spring arrived. Woodworkers also spent winter crafting useful items, such as barrels, baskets, and furniture. These tasks kept people productive while waiting for warmer weather. Another overlooked winter survival technique involved careful fire management during the night. Keeping a fire burning all night required a steady supply of fuel, but allowing the fire to burn too strongly could waste precious wood. Experienced household members learned how to bank the fire before sleeping. This meant covering burning embers with ash or arranging logs so they would burn slowly through the night. By morning, enough heat remained to easily restart the fire. This skill saved time and fuel while maintaining warmth in the home. Another practice involved using heated stones. Stones placed near the fire could absorb heat. Later, these warm stones were wrapped in cloth and placed near beds or under blankets. The stones slowly released warmth, making sleeping areas more comfortable. This technique was especially useful during extremely cold nights. Another survival method involved managing clothing carefully. Clothing was expensive and time-consuming to produce, so garments were repaired whenever possible. Small holes were patched, seams were reinforced, and worn-out fabrics were reused in other items. Old clothing might be turned into blankets, padding, or insulation. Nothing was thrown away if it could still serve a purpose. Another important winter habit involved rationing candle use. Because candles required valuable materials, such as tallow or beeswax, they were used sparingly. Families often relied on the light of the hearth instead. When candles were used, they were placed carefully to provide maximum illumination. Even small decisions about lighting affected how long supplies would last. Winter demanded careful thinking about every resource. Food, fuel, clothing, and light all had to last until warmer days returned. Despite these challenges, medieval communities developed systems that allowed them to survive winter year after year. Their methods may appear simple today, but they were built on centuries of knowledge and experience. And as we continue exploring the forgotten survival techniques of the Middle Ages, we will discover even more fascinating strategies that allowed people to endure the harshest seasons. Because winter survival was not based on one single solution. It was a combination of many small practices, each contributing to the resilience of medieval life. Together, these methods formed a powerful system that helped communities endure months of cold, darkness, and uncertainty. And through patience, cooperation, and preparation, they waited for the moment when the frozen earth would begin to thaw once again. As winter moved deeper into its coldest stage, the medieval world entered a period of endurance that tested both the body and the mind. Snow often covered the land for weeks, sometimes months. Rivers hardened into long sheets of ice, and the sounds of daily life became quieter. For many people, winter created a strange mixture of stillness and constant effort. The fields no longer demanded daily labor, but survival required attention to many smaller tasks. Each day involved maintaining warmth, protecting food stores, and ensuring that animals and people remained healthy. One of the lesser-known survival methods during the Middle Ages involved underground storage. While many foods were preserved through drying, smoking, or salting, some items were kept fresh through the use of root cellars. These underground spaces were carefully designed to take advantage of the natural temperature of the earth. Even when the air outside dropped far below freezing, the temperature underground remained relatively stable. This made root cellars ideal for storing vegetables such as turnips, carrots, onions, and cabbage. Farmers would dig storage pits or build small underground rooms beneath houses or barns. The walls were sometimes reinforced with wood or stone, and straw was used to create insulation. Food stored inside these spaces could last for many months. Another forgotten survival method involved the careful layering of stored crops. Vegetables placed in storage were often separated by layers of straw or sand. This prevented moisture from spreading between them and reduced the risk of spoilage. By checking these stores regularly, families could remove any spoiled food before it affected the rest of the supply. This attention to detail helped to preserve valuable resources during the long winter. Another important survival technique involved the protection of stored grain. Grain was vulnerable to rodents and insects, even during winter. To prevent damage, storage containers were often elevated above the ground. Wooden platforms or stone pillars supported storage bins so that pests could not easily reach them. Some storage areas were also sealed tightly with clay or mud to block small openings. These methods protected the food that communities depended on for bread and porridge. Another fascinating survival strategy involved winter travel. While many journeys were avoided during the coldest months, certain types of travel actually became easier. When roads turned to mud during autumn rains, carts often struggled to move. But once the ground froze solid, sleds could glide smoothly across snow and ice. In northern and eastern regions of Europe, sled transport became common during winter. Merchants and traders used sleds pulled by horses or oxen to carry goods between towns. These sleds required less effort than wheeled carts and could travel across frozen rivers, which sometimes became temporary highways. However, winter travel still carried serious risks. Blizzards could appear suddenly, covering paths and making navigation difficult. Travelers often followed known landmarks such as forests, hills, or church towers to avoid getting lost. Stopping places were also important. Inns, monasteries, and small villages served as shelters where travelers could warm themselves and find food. Hospitality during winter was often considered a moral duty. Providing shelter to someone caught in a storm could save their life. Another forgotten winter survival method involved the careful use of body heat. In many homes, people gathered closely together during the coldest hours of the day. Families worked, ate, and rested in the same room, allowing shared body heat to help warm the space. Animals kept nearby also contributed to this warmth. Barns built close to homes allowed heat from livestock to influence nearby living spaces. While this arrangement might seem unusual today, it was an effective way to conserve heat. Another important aspect of winter survival involved maintaining the roof of the house. Heavy snow could create dangerous weight on thatched or wooden roofs. Families often climbed onto roofs or used long poles to remove excessive snow. This prevented structural damage that could collapse part of the building. However, some snow was allowed to remain because it acted as insulation. The challenge was finding the balance between protection and safety. Another interesting survival technique involved using frozen lakes and rivers for food. Ice fishing was practiced in some regions where water sources froze solid. People cut holes in the ice and lowered fishing lines or nets into the water below. Fish caught this way provided valuable protein during months when hunting was more difficult. Hunting itself became more challenging in winter, but it did not disappear completely. Snow sometimes made it easier to track animal footprints. Hunters could follow these tracks through forests to locate deer, rabbits, or other animals. Animal skins collected during winter were especially valuable because they were thick and warm. These furs could be turned into clothing, blankets, or trade goods. Another important winter survival method involved maintaining firewood supplies carefully. By the middle of winter, families had already used a large portion of their stored wood. This meant that every piece of firewood had to be used wisely. Smaller pieces were often burned during the day when less heat was required. Larger logs were saved for night when temperatures dropped further. This strategy helped stretch limited fuel supplies over many weeks. Ashes from burned wood also played a role in daily life. Wood ash could be mixed with water to create a basic cleaning solution. It was also used in the production of simple soaps. Even the remains of a fire were useful. Another forgotten practice involved keeping indoor spaces dry. Moisture inside homes could make cold conditions feel even harsher. Wet clothing and boots were usually dried near the hearth. Proper drying prevented fabrics from freezing or developing unpleasant odors. It also helped clothing last longer. Another fascinating winter habit involved monitoring daylight closely. Because days were short, medieval people learned to value every hour of sunlight. Outdoor work, such as gathering wood, repairing fences, or feeding animals, was done early in the day. As the sun set, people shifted to indoor activities. These evening hours were often quieter. Some people used the time for prayer or reflection. Others focused on crafts such as spinning wool, weaving cloth, or carving wooden objects. Winter became a season of craftsmanship. Items produced during this time were used throughout the year or traded in local markets once travel became easier. Another survival method involved preserving social connections. Isolation could be dangerous during winter. Neighbors checked on each other, especially the elderly or those living alone. Shared meals and small gatherings helped maintain a sense of community. In times of extreme cold or food shortages, communities sometimes pooled their remaining supplies. This cooperation increased the chances that everyone would survive until spring. Another overlooked aspect of winter survival involved the role of faith and belief. Religion played a central role in medieval life, and winter often strengthened this connection. Many people believed that harsh winters were part of a divine plan or natural cycle. Prayer, rituals, and religious gatherings offered comfort during uncertain times. Churches also served as places where communities could gather, share news, and support one another. Another fascinating survival strategy involved careful observation of ice and snow conditions. People who lived near frozen rivers or lakes learned to recognize safe ice. Clear blue ice was often considered stronger than cloudy or white ice. By paying attention to these details, travelers and fishermen reduced the risk of falling through the frozen surface. Despite all these techniques, winter remained unpredictable. Some years brought mild conditions, while others delivered brutal cold that lasted far longer than expected. During the harshest winters, food supplies sometimes ran dangerously low. Communities responded by reducing portions and relying on the simplest meals possible. Bread, porridge, and preserved vegetables became the foundation of daily nutrition. Yet even in these difficult circumstances, medieval people rarely lost hope. They had survived many winters before, and they believed they could survive again. Experience taught them that every frozen morning brought them closer to the return of warmth. Slowly, almost unnoticed at first, the days began to grow slightly longer. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and beneath the frozen ground, the first quiet signs of spring began to prepare for their return. But before winter finally released its grip, there were still more challenges to face, and the people of the Middle Ages relied on every bit of knowledge, patience, and resilience they possessed to endure the final weeks of the cold season. As winter stretched into its later months, medieval communities often reached the most difficult point of the season. Food supplies had been slowly decreasing since autumn. Firewood piles were smaller than they once were, and the cold sometimes felt endless. This part of winter was often the true test of preparation. Those who had carefully planned their resources usually managed to endure, but those who had been less fortunate sometimes faced severe hardship. One of the most challenging periods in medieval winter history occurred during the climate shift known today as the Little Ice Age. During this time, temperatures across much of Europe dropped noticeably for several centuries. Winters became longer, storms grew more intense, and frozen landscapes lasted far longer than people had previously experienced. For medieval societies that already depended heavily on seasonal cycles, these colder conditions created serious difficulties. Rivers froze earlier in the year and stayed frozen for longer periods. In some regions, thick ice covered waterways that were normally used for trade and transportation. Yet people adapted in remarkable ways. Frozen rivers sometimes became winter roads. Merchants, farmers, and travelers could move across ice using sleds or simple wooden runners attached to carts. This allowed goods to continue moving between towns, even when normal roads were blocked by snow or mud. Winter markets occasionally formed directly on the frozen surfaces of large rivers. These unusual marketplaces allowed communities to trade food, tools, clothing, and other goods despite the harsh conditions. Another forgotten survival method during extremely cold winters involved the careful use of underground spaces. Cellars beneath houses became important shelters for food, tools, and sometimes even people. Because underground areas remained warmer than the air outside, they offered protection against extreme cold. In some situations, small animals such as chickens or goats were temporarily kept in these sheltered spaces during severe storms. This helped prevent them from freezing, while also protecting valuable livestock. Another survival strategy involved the construction of wind barriers. Strong winter winds could make temperatures feel far colder than they actually were. To reduce this effect, people sometimes built simple barriers using wooden fences, stacked branches, or stone walls. These structures slowed the wind and created calmer areas around homes and barns. Even a small reduction in wind could make a noticeable difference in comfort and survival. Another fascinating winter survival technique involved maintaining warmth through constant small movement. Remaining completely still for long periods could cause the body to lose heat quickly. Medieval people often performed small tasks throughout the day to keep their bodies active. Spinning wool, carving wood, repairing clothing, or preparing food allowed people to stay warm without exhausting themselves. Even children participated in these activities. They learned early that keeping busy during winter helped the body maintain warmth. Another forgotten practice involved managing drinking water carefully. In extremely cold weather, stored water inside homes could begin to freeze overnight. To prevent this, containers were sometimes wrapped in cloth or placed close to the hearth. This gentle heat kept the water in liquid form. Without access to liquid water, even simple tasks like cooking or feeding animals would become difficult. Another important survival method involved the preservation of fats. Animal fats were incredibly valuable during winter. They provided a concentrated source of energy that helped the body maintain warmth. Fat was used in cooking, added to soups, and sometimes spread on bread. In addition to food, animal fat was also used to create candles and waterproof certain materials. This made it one of the most versatile resources available during winter months. Another interesting technique involved the use of fur clothing. Fur garments were particularly valuable during extremely cold winters. The dense layers of animal hair trapped warm air close to the body. Sheepskin coats, rabbit fur linings, and other animal skins were commonly used for winter clothing. Even small pieces of fur were saved and reused in gloves, hats, or collars. Nothing was wasted if it could help someone stay warm. Another survival strategy involved watching for signs of the coming spring. Medieval people paid close attention to small changes in the natural world. The lengthening of daylight was often the first noticeable sign. Even a few extra minutes of sunlight each day brought hope that winter was slowly losing its strength. Certain birds returning earlier than expected could also signal the approach of warmer weather. Farmers used these signs to begin preparing mentally for the next farming season. Another forgotten winter survival method involved maintaining mental resilience. The psychological effects of long winters could be just as challenging as the physical ones. Darkness, cold, and isolation sometimes cause feelings of exhaustion or discouragement. Communities responded by strengthening social bonds. Neighbors visited each other more frequently during winter. Shared meals, storytelling, and small celebrations helped lift spirits. Music was also important. Simple instruments such as flutes, drums, or stringed instruments were sometimes played during gatherings. These moments of joy helped people endure the difficult season. Another survival method involved using salt carefully. Salt was essential for preserving meat and fish. But during winter, supplies of salt could become limited. Families learned to ration it carefully so that preserved foods would last until spring. Without enough salt, valuable food could spoil quickly. Another important winter survival habit involved protecting livestock from freezing winds. Barns were often designed with narrow openings to prevent strong drafts. Straw bedding was replaced regularly to keep animals dry and insulated. Farmers also checked animals frequently during snowstorms to ensure they remained safe. Healthy animals meant milk, meat, and labor once the weather improved. Another fascinating survival technique involved using heated bricks or stones during travel. Travelers sometimes warmed stones near a fire before beginning their journey. These stones were wrapped in cloth and placed inside clothing or under blankets. The stored heat provided warmth during the early part of the trip. While the warmth did not last forever, it helped travelers endure the first hours of exposure to the cold. Another survival method involved careful observation of snow conditions. Different types of snow behaved in different ways. Soft powder could slow movement, while packed snow created smoother travel paths. People learned how to walk or move sleds efficiently across these surfaces. This knowledge made winter travel safer and less exhausting. Another important aspect of winter survival involved maintaining hope through tradition. Many medieval festivals took place during the coldest part of the year. These celebrations reminded communities that winter was not permanent. Food, music, dancing, and religious gatherings created moments of warmth during the darkest months. The winter solstice was especially meaningful. It marked the moment when days began to grow longer again. For medieval people, this was a powerful symbol that the cold season would eventually come to an end. And as winter slowly moved towards its final weeks, the frozen world began to show subtle signs of change. Snow sometimes melted briefly during warmer days. Icicles dripped slowly from rooftops. Birdsong returned in quiet moments. These small changes signaled that the long battle against winter was nearing its end. But before spring could fully arrive, medieval communities still relied on every survival method they had developed over centuries. Their knowledge, resilience, and cooperation allowed them to endure one of nature's most demanding seasons. And as we move further into the story of these forgotten survival techniques, we will soon discover how medieval societies prepared for the final transition from winter to spring. Because surviving winter was only part of the challenge. The real success came in emerging from the cold season, ready to begin the cycle of life once again. By the time the later weeks of winter arrived in the Middle Ages, survival depended less on preparation and more on endurance. Most communities had already used a large portion of their stored supplies. The piles of firewood were smaller, food stores were thinner, and yet the cold often still lingered across the land. This period was sometimes the hardest part of winter. Medieval people understood this well. They even had quiet sayings and traditions that reflected the struggle of these final cold weeks. It was the time when patience mattered most, when every remaining resource had to be used carefully until the earth finally began to thaw. One of the most important survival methods during this stage of winter involved stretching the last of the food supplies. Meals became simpler and smaller. Large stews that once included meat were now often made mostly from grains and root vegetables. Barley, oats, and rye were turned into thick porridges that could feed entire families. These meals were not luxurious, but they were filling. A bowl of warm porridge provided energy and warmth, two things that were especially important during cold days. Bread continued to play a central role in the medieval winter diet, but by the late weeks of winter, flour supplies were often running low. To make bread last longer, bakers sometimes mixed flour with other ingredients, such as crushed peas, beans, or ground roots. These additions stretched the supply while still producing something edible. The result was often heavier and darker bread, but it helped people survive until the next harvest. Another forgotten winter survival method involved gathering early wild foods. Even before spring fully arrived, certain plants began to grow quietly beneath the snow or along forest edges. People who knew the land well searched for these early signs of life. Young nettles, wild garlic, and certain leafy plants were among the first to appear. Though small in quantity, these fresh greens were incredibly valuable. After months of eating preserved foods, the vitamins in fresh plants helped restore strength to the body. These early plants were often added to soups or boiled into simple dishes. For medieval families, they were a sign that winter's grip was beginning to weaken. Another fascinating survival practice involved tapping trees for sap. In some regions, people collected sap from certain trees near the end of winter. This sap could be boiled down to create a sweet syrup or used directly as a drink. Though the process required time and effort, it provided a rare source of sweetness during a season when sugar and honey were scarce. Another survival strategy involved using every possible part of stored foods. Nothing was wasted. Bones from earlier meals were often saved and added to boiling pots to extract every bit of flavor and nutrition. These broths formed the base of many winter soups. Even vegetable scraps were used whenever possible. Peelings, stems, and leftover pieces were added to cooking pots rather than thrown away. This careful use of resources helped ensure that the final weeks of winter could be endured. Another forgotten technique involved managing firewood during the final cold period. By late winter, families had often used most of the wood they gathered months earlier. This required careful planning. Small fires were maintained rather than large ones. People stayed closer together inside homes to share warmth. In some cases, families gathered fallen branches or smaller pieces of wood from nearby forests to extend their fuel supply. Another interesting winter survival method involved using sunlight whenever possible. Even though winter days were short, the sunlight that did appear became important. People sometimes opened shutters during the brightest part of the day to allow sunlight into their homes. This small amount of natural warmth helped reduce the need for additional firewood. It also improved visibility inside homes without using precious candles. Another survival strategy during the final weeks of winter involved preparing quietly for the coming spring. Even while snow still covered the ground, medieval farmers began planning their next planting season. Seeds were inspected to make sure they were still usable. Tools were sharpened and repaired. Wooden handles were replaced, metal edges were polished, and broken equipment was fixed. This work ensured that when the soil finally thawed, farming could begin immediately. Another important winter survival habit involved observing changes in the weather. The end of winter rarely arrived suddenly. Instead, it appeared through small and gradual changes. Snow melted briefly during warm afternoons, only to freeze again at night. Icicles dripped slowly from rooftops. Streams began to flow again as ice weakened. Medieval people watched these signs carefully. They knew that the transition from winter to spring could also bring dangers. Melting snow sometimes created floods or muddy roads that made travel difficult. Preparing for these changes required awareness and flexibility. Another fascinating survival method involved repairing clothing before the start of spring work. Winter clothing often experienced heavy wear during months of cold weather. Before the busy farming season returned, families carefully inspected their garments. Torn seams were repaired, holes were patched, and worn-out sections were reinforced. This ensured that clothing remained useful for as long as possible. Fabric was valuable, and replacing it was not easy. Another survival strategy involved caring for animals that had endured the long winter. Livestock often emerged from winter thinner and weaker than before. Farmers provided extra attention to animals during this period. Fresh water, remaining hay, and early grasses helped restore their strength. Healthy animals were essential for plowing fields, producing milk, and supporting the household economy. Another forgotten winter practice involved cleaning and refreshing living spaces. During winter, homes could become crowded with stored goods, tools, and indoor activities. As the weather began to improve slightly, families sometimes took the opportunity to clean their homes. Old straw bedding was replaced, ashes were cleared from hearths, and storage areas were reorganized. These tasks prepared the household for the busy months ahead. Another important survival method involved strengthening community connections. The end of winter was often a time when neighbors helped each other prepare for the coming farming season. Tools were shared, advice was exchanged, and plans were discussed. Communities that worked together were more likely to succeed when spring arrived. This cooperation had been essential throughout winter, and it continued to shape life in the warmer months. Another fascinating aspect of medieval winter survival involved the emotional relief that came with the first clear signs of spring. After months of cold darkness, the return of longer days lifted spirits. Birdsong returned to forests and fields. Animals became more active, and the sun stayed in the sky just a little longer each day. For medieval people, these small changes were powerful reminders that the hardest season was nearly over. They had endured the cold, protected their families, and preserved enough resources to continue. Survival through winter was not simply a matter of luck. It was the result of knowledge, preparation, and resilience. Generations had passed down the techniques needed to endure harsh conditions, from preserving food and building warm homes, to managing firewood and supporting neighbors. Every method played a role. Together, these forgotten survival strategies allowed medieval societies to withstand winters that could last for many long months. And as the frozen ground slowly softened beneath the growing warmth of the sun, communities began preparing for the return of life. Because in the Middle Ages, surviving winter was only the first step. The next challenge was rebuilding, planting, and beginning the cycle again. As winter slowly approached its final stage, medieval communities began to feel the quiet shift in the rhythm of life. The cold was still present, and snow often remained across the fields. But something had begun to change. The days were becoming longer. Sunlight lingered a little later in the afternoon, and the frozen silence of winter was slowly giving way to the faint sounds of returning life. For people in the Middle Ages, this transition was one of the most important moments of the year. Surviving the long winter had required months of patience, careful planning, and constant work. Now the focus slowly shifted toward rebuilding and preparing for the coming growing season. One of the first signs that winter was weakening came from the behavior of animals. Birds that had disappeared during the cold months began to return. Their songs, which had been absent for much of winter, once again echoed through forests and villages. These sounds were more than just pleasant to hear. For medieval farmers, they were signals that the natural cycle was beginning to move forward again. Another important sign came from the melting snow. During warmer afternoons, patches of ground began to appear, where sunlight reached the earth directly. Though the nights were still cold, these small openings in the snow allowed farmers to examine the condition of the soil. This early observation helped them plan the timing of their spring planting. Another forgotten survival method during this transitional period involved carefully managing the final winter supplies. Even though spring was approaching, it was still important to ration food and fuel. A sudden cold spell could easily return, extending winter for several more weeks. Families continued to prepare simple meals from the last remaining stores of grain, dried vegetables, and preserved foods. Stews and soups remained common because they used ingredients efficiently and provided warmth during chilly evenings. Another important winter survival habit involved preparing tools for the coming agricultural work. Throughout the winter months, many tools had already been repaired and sharpened. But now farmers inspected them again with greater urgency. Plows needed to be strong enough to break through soil that had been hardened by months of cold. Axes and cutting tools had to be ready for clearing branches and repairing fences. Wooden handles were checked carefully, and damaged parts were replaced when necessary. This preparation ensured that once the soil became workable, farming could begin immediately. Another fascinating survival practice involved preparing seeds for planting. Seeds saved from the previous harvest were carefully inspected during the final weeks of winter. Farmers checked for signs of rot, moisture, or damage. Healthy seeds were separated and stored in dry containers until the soil was ready. Protecting these seeds was incredibly important because they represented the future food supply for the entire community. Without viable seeds, the next harvest could fail. Another forgotten winter survival method involved repairing buildings that had suffered damage during the cold season. Heavy snow, strong winds, and freezing temperatures often weakened roofs, fences, and storage structures. As soon as weather conditions allowed, families began inspecting these buildings. Loose thatch was repaired, broken boards were replaced, and fences were strengthened to protect livestock. These repairs were essential before the busy farming season began. Another interesting survival technique involved using the final weeks of winter to prepare new tools and household items. Woodworkers continued carving handles, bowls, and storage containers. Basket makers created woven containers that would be used during the harvest season. Blacksmiths remained busy repairing metal tools and crafting new blades. These crafts provided essential equipment that supported farming and daily life. Another survival strategy involved restoring strength after the difficult winter months. Many people emerged from winter physically weaker due to limited food supplies and months of cold weather. As early greens and fresh foods slowly became available, people added them to their meals whenever possible. These fresh foods helped restore nutrients that had been missing during winter. Wild herbs, young plants, and early vegetables provided vitamins that improved health and energy. Another forgotten survival practice involved cleaning storage spaces. Granaries, cellars, and food containers that had held winter supplies were emptied and cleaned. Any remaining spoiled food was removed, and storage areas were aired out. This cleaning process helped prevent pests and mold from affecting future harvests. Another important habit during this time involved preparing livestock for the return of outdoor grazing. Animals that had spent months in barns were slowly reintroduced to open areas. Farmers checked their animals carefully for signs of illness or weakness. Healthy livestock would soon play an important role in ploughing fields and producing milk. Another fascinating winter survival method involved watching the rivers and streams. As temperatures rose, ice began to weaken. This process could be dangerous because sudden flooding sometimes occurred when large pieces of ice broke apart. Communities living near rivers paid close attention to these changes. Bridges and paths near water were inspected to ensure they remained safe. Another survival strategy involved restoring travel routes. Roads that had been covered by snow or damaged by ice needed to be cleared. Travel between villages slowly resumed as conditions improved. Merchants prepared to move goods again, bringing tools, fabrics, and other supplies to local markets. Trade that had slowed during winter began to return. Another important aspect of the transition from winter to spring involved community cooperation. Neighbors often worked together during these early preparation weeks. Groups of villagers might repair shared roads, rebuild damaged fences, or help each other prepare fields. This cooperation had been essential for surviving winter, and it remained just as important for rebuilding afterward. Another fascinating tradition during the end of winter involved small celebrations that welcomed the coming spring. These gatherings were not always large festivals, but they were meaningful moments of relief. People shared simple meals, sang songs, and spoke about the plans for the new season. These celebrations reminded communities that the long, cold months were finally ending. Another forgotten survival method involved protecting early crops from late frost. Even as the weather improved, sudden cold nights could still damage young plants. Farmers sometimes covered seedlings with straw or branches to protect them. This simple technique helped fragile plants survive unexpected cold spells. Another interesting survival strategy involved maintaining careful observation of weather patterns. Spring weather could change quickly, and sudden storms were still possible. Farmers watched clouds, wind direction, and animal behavior for signs of shifting conditions. This awareness helped them decide when it was safe to begin planting. Another important practice involved teaching the younger generation. Children who had grown through the winter months were often taught practical survival skills during this time. They learned how to care for animals, repair simple tools, and recognize early signs of changing seasons. These lessons ensured that the knowledge of winter survival would continue into the future. Because in the Middle Ages, survival depended not only on individual effort, but also on the wisdom passed from one generation to the next. And as the frozen ground finally began to soften beneath the warming sun, medieval communities prepared to begin the cycle again. The long winter had tested their strength and patience, but through knowledge, cooperation, and resilience, they had endured. Now the promise of spring offered new opportunities for growth, harvest, and life. And with the lessons of winter still fresh in their minds, they stepped forward into the new season with determination and hope. They stepped forward into the new season with determination and hope.